welcome back to Coaching with the Bible. This is episode 74, season 2, episode 20. The reading this week, the portion of Tetzaveh. Our topic this week, showing up. I'm in the middle right now of reading an extraordinary book. I've been reading it for a very long time. It's called Washington, A Life. It's one of the great biographies of the first president of the United States, George Washington, and it really covers the entirety of his life from beginning to end. It's an extraordinary book. It's taken me a very long time to get through. It happens that today, I was reading this morning about George Washington's first inauguration, or the first inauguration that was ever held in the United States for president. Took place on April 30th, 1789 in New York City, downtown Manhattan. It's an amazing book in general because you learn a tremendous amount about the person known as George Washington and about American history, obviously, which he embodied. And in this particular section, talking about the inauguration, it's fascinating in which it notes that George Washington, specifically on that date, dressed differently than he might have had he been in battle, than he might have the day before, and than he would, in fact, the day after. And specifically at that inauguration, Washington wore clothing that was made in America. He was very mindful of where the materials came from, who would be the tailors for his suit, what the buttons would look like on that suit. And he was very much paying attention to the notion that he should look American and not British, that he should have some sort of an appearance when he showed up at that inauguration of being the embodiment, the spirit, the soul, the emblem of America and the American people. It happens to be that with that date, with that inauguration, that he in fact established a number of customs that have continued to take place with respect to the inauguration. The notion of putting a hand on a Bible, the notion of walking a certain distance outside of some sort of a vehicle up into that space or away from that space. All the parties, the pomp and the circumstance, all was part of the plan that he put into place along with the other founders at the time. So it's fascinating to read because he was paying attention to all these things. He was mindful of how he showed up that day. It wasn't just about appearance, because I think if we simply just focus on the notion of the dress, that's one thing. And we lose out a lot when we don't think about the other factors involved in that decision-making with respect to showing up as the emblem, as the symbol, as the being of what it was to be the American president. And so it had me thinking about this particular portion of the Bible, because in this week's reading, we read a lot about the vestments, the clothing, the different pieces that the priest would wear, the regular priest and then the high priest, in terms of the different clothing that they would wear. And they simply couldn't just wear anything. They couldn't simply just wear the clothing of the time when they went in to do their work. They had to be dressed in a very specific manner. The high priest, even more specific, with certain vestments and certain clothing and certain items on his body at certain times during certain work and not at other times, meaning when they go into the greater detail, there's a distinction in what he was allowed to wear when he did most of his work, than what he was allowed to do when he was doing the work inside the Holy of Holies, specifically on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. So it went from eight garments to 4 garments, and there's a lot that goes on, and specifically the one that has captured my mind over the last number of weeks is the cloak and the bells and pomegranates that hung at the base of that garment. The garment was made of that blue, that techelet, that's the term in Hebrew for that color, that blue color of royalty, color of being regal, a color that we see a little bit of today. It was a garment that was completely against his skin, no separation. And it's a garment that he, the high priest, uniquely wore. And then I think about it, and I think about the high priest wearing that garment upon entering the tabernacle, the Mishkan, as it's called in the Bible, or later on into the temple in Jerusalem, the Beit HaMikdash. The idea, if you can picture in your mind and hear in your mind sort of the bells at his feet ringing upon his entry, that you could hear him coming from a distance. We get a little bit of that today when one of the Torah scrolls is removed from the ark and is carried to the table to be read. So a lot of them, in a lot of places, in a lot of communities, are adorned with a crown, and a lot of those crowns have bells. And so you hear a little bit of that ringing as the Torah scroll is being brought to be read. But when I think about it with respect to a person walking with that kind of garment on and the bells at the base and the ringing of it, what that was symbolic of and what was trying to be accomplished there. Because the person was the person. Aaron, the first high priest, or later the other subsequent high priests, they embodied the people in many, many ways. But the clothing was an additional component of it. If they did the service in the wrong clothing, or with the clothing even off by a slight measure, then the work did not count. If it was the wrong color, the work did not count. If it was woven without intent, according to many opinions, then the clothing is not valid or appropriate, and then the work being done, again, did not count. And so clothing is a key factor, not just in appearance, and here's where we're going to go with this, is in the manner in which you show up. Because the manner in which you show up is more than just the appearance that you bring. It's what you embody. It's what you have in mind. It's your intent. It goes to purpose. It probably goes to preparation as well. And so the priest who's wearing his set of clothing is there. He's in the tabernacle. He's in the temple. He's doing some work. Along comes the high priest and he's ringing, literally ringing as he's entering. It is supposed to do one additional thing, was to set the tone, the mindset, the manner in which the people are to show up to do their service and to do their work. It's more than just a physical being standing there. It's literally ringing in your ears. Because what can happen is that if we're simply wearing clothing, so we're wearing clothing and it's like anything else we wear, we lose sight of it, we lose focus on it, we don't remember the intent or the additional ideas that are symbolic or emblematic or built in to what it is that we're wearing. But the ringing, the music, the sound of it is much, much deeper, much, much more powerful. And so Aaron, the high priest, George Washington, if we have to distinguish, let's distinguish for a second, those are not the same things, are cognizant and mindful and aware and paying attention to the manner in which they have to show up in those moments. Maybe it was Washington on day one, but it was really very much the way he held himself and behaved all the time. Certainly, on another level, is the high priest in the temple, or to the leader, to Moses, the manner in which Moses comported himself, the manner in which Moses appeared before the people, the manner in which he held himself, the manner in which he behaved, because of how much that means in terms of how you show up. And so the Bible is teaching us an additional component here, not just the idea of that the priest has to wear certain clothing, and that if he doesn't wear that clothing, then the work doesn't count. No. The Bible is teaching us the notion of how we show ourselves in key moments, how we bring ourselves to bear in those moments in our lives. We bring it today into the manner of religious practice, very much in the sense of how we appear physically when we come to a holy place or we come to a holy moment. So we dress a certain way. We're coming to prayer and we bring ourselves physically to look a certain way. The notion that we embody a certain ethic, a certain faith, a certain belief system, and so that when we show up somewhere else, we are the symbol of that in that location. We become the one person as a representative, for perhaps lack of a better term, but the representative of all of that in that space, whether we want to or we don't. And so the question the Bible is asking us is, how do we show up in any and all of those moments? But then in our own lives, it's not too different. Thinking about this a lot lately with respect to work, with respect to meetings, with respect to relationships, how we show up in those spaces, in those times. Just specifically this last week, my head's been a little bit in a fog, so sort of like a lot of people around the world coming out of having had COVID. So thank God, it really was a mild case of COVID overall, generally speaking. I'm really appreciative and really thankful and have a lot of gratitude about that, because I know that it could have been worse. And the lingering effect is that I'm sort of a little bit tired earlier, more quickly than I had been literally 2 weeks ago, but also that my brain is still a little bit unclear, a little bit of that fog that's sort of still there. And during the course of the week in quarantine, I canceled a lot of meetings. Did work as much as I could, but canceled a lot of those in-person one-on-one meetings. And the reason why was because the sense that I have to show up at those meetings. I have to appear at those meetings. I have to be at my best during those interactions with people, because here's key one with respect to showing up. It's not always just about my expectation level. In fact, it's very much not. It's more about other people's expectation level with respect to how I'm going to show up in that space, what they need from me in that moment, in that time. And if I can't bring that, what in fact am I doing? That first impression of me in that meeting happens in an instant. The first time a person meets us at an interview, the first time a person meets us on a date, in a relationship, how we show up, there's that first impression. We may make that first impression in split second, less than a second, a tenth of a second. We have already decided what we're going to think and how we're going to think. And then to change that is really, really hard. And so how we show up, how we comport ourselves, how we look, how we prepare, how we present is all in the sense of showing up as the leader. And so in these meetings where I have to be that, I knew that I couldn't do it. And so I didn't have most of those meetings. It's said very much about Joe DiMaggio, famous iconic baseball player, the New York Yankees, who played a certain way every day. And when he was asked about it once, he said, as simple as this: there's always some kid who may be seeing me for the first time. I owe him my best. Simple idea about showing up. Showing up is important. Showing up is, as a lot of people say, is 80% of the work, for sure. And as Brene Brown says a lot, sometimes the bravest and most important thing you can do is just show up. That is certainly true. And there are some moments when you can't bring any more and all you can do is show up. But there's more to it than simply just being there physically. It's being there mentally. It's being there prepared. It's coming in with a notion of how I'm going to do this, how this is going to work, how I can bring my best to that situation. Sometimes even when I don't have it, but I have to bring it. So how do we do that? So a lot of it, I think, is very much about how we think about it. It's sort of preparation, I think, is very important here, is to be, really focused on how I'm going to come into that, what people are expecting of me in that space. Last year, during the course of one of the lockdowns, I was testing out a really interesting virtual event software, and I attended a meeting on this virtual event software, and they had as a guest this guy who's a professional MC. And he talked about how he now prepares for virtual events versus in-person events. And one of the things he said is really, it was interesting, was that before the camera goes on, before he turns on his video camera, he does a little pre-game ritual. Excuse me. And he gets himself mentally psyched up and focused in on what it is that he's doing before it is that he goes in and is ready. I sort of adopted that. I have that sort of idea. Before I turn the camera on for a meeting, I stop, I take a deep breath, I focus on what it is after having obviously done preparation in advance, but I focus in on what it is that I'm supposed to be doing there. I do my best to come into that meeting with the best version of myself because it's important for the people that I'm meeting with to make sure that I'm showing up, being as authentic and as real and as possible as I can be in that space, as present as I can be, as authentic as I can be, as me as I can be, as much as they can take of me being me. Because the notion here again is the notion of that first impression in that first moment, and the notion, just like George Washington on that inauguration day, and just like Aaron on that first day and all those days as the high priest, appreciating what it is that you embody when it is that you are expected to show up. If it's an athlete, so they represent their team and they represent their teammates or a city and their fans. If it's a president, they're the embodiment of their people. So that's different. If they're the high priest, then they are the spiritual leader of their community. If it's a person in business, then they're showing up for their employees, for their partners, for their team. If it's at home, it's that ability to come into a space and be present and available and focused for the people that you care about, that you love. It's a very powerful and very difficult thing to always do. We're not always there, and sometimes we have to apologize and bow out and not be able to accomplish it. But it is something that we have to pay attention to. When the Bible brings it up, it's specifically here focused on the temple and the tabernacle in that space with Aaron, the high priest. But it's something that we have to think about and something that we have to work on consistently and always in our own lives. And the question, ask yourself today, is how do I show up? How do I appear? How do I present? How do I comport myself? When I have to be in those spaces, when I have to be in those moments, when I have to be ready and available, how do I do that? And if I'm not happy with it, how do I do that better? As the leader, how do I show up better as the leader? An important question for all leaders. An important question for you to think about. That is Coaching with the Bible for this week. Look forward to seeing you next week.